Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock. I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 264, The BSJ's New Editor.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello, and welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you in need of editing services?
I am really in need of editing. First of all, I need an index. I mean, I can't find anything anymore. So I need an index, which is a big deal, and then I need some editing, and I need a lot of rewriting.
Wait.
And then I'm going to need some binding and some proofreading. In fact, I need a team. I need an editorial team.
You definitely need some binding, that is for sure.
I do.
So what's the difference between an index and a pandex? And Windex?
Well, Windex is something you use to clean stains off your pan. The pandex is the arrangement of pans in the kitchen. And the index is usually on your right hand or left hand, and it's the first finger. I'm surprised, with all of the resources at your disposal, why you have questions like this?
Well, it's a good question. I am always questioning the world around me, and particularly when it seems like there's something that we've taken for granted for so long. I thought it was worthy of discussion. But my question is, can you do indexing outdoors?
Well, sure you can, but you just mentioned taking things for granted. The interesting thing is to tell the difference between granite and marble. Marble usually comes out of a quarry. Granite is sometimes found on the floors of bathrooms or tiles. I don't hear you writing any of these things down.
You need a good pumicing. You've got a pumicing future, Bert, but it's not with us. I'm sorry.
That wonderful old song, "Oh, Pumice Me." Yes.
Goodness gracious. Well, enough of this. We have a wonderful interview lined up today with Dan Andriacco. Dan is the newly named editor of the Baker Street Journal. He's been with us here before on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, but from the perspective of being an author. So we're going to turn the tables a little bit now as Dan has turned his focus from authorship to editorship in taking over from Steve Rothman as editor of the Baker Street Journal. Steve, of course, served more than 2 decades in that role. So it'll be interesting to see what Dan brings to the journal, what he's going to maintain, what he's going to refresh, and where the journal may head in the future. We would like to remind you that the show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/ihose264, all lowercase. You'll find those in the podcast player where we have some of our show notes. If you click on that link, it'll take you directly to the ihearofsherlock.com website. where we will have all kinds of links, including how to get to us on various social networks, links to the Baker Street Journal, of course, to Dan's previous episode, and to other things that we may mention throughout the show here in today's episode. We'll also have a link to our Patreon page. Our Patreon supporters get to listen to these shows ad-free, and they are also eligible for various thank you gifts that we send out at different levels. And by virtue of supporting I Hear of Sherlock everywhere, for as little as $1 a month, or to whatever degree you feel you can handle, it means that you will help us with all of the background administrative stuff and the hosting costs and everything that goes into producing a quality show like this. And just a reminder, here at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, we put the K in quality, so you don't need to worry about it. A former journalist and reviewer of mystery books, Dan Andriacco has been the leader of the Tankerville Club, a science society of the Baker Street Irregulars since 2018, and a member since 1981. He's written much and spoken widely about Sherlock Holmes while producing at least one new mystery novel a year since 2011. And you may remember such titles as No Ghosts Need Apply, Murderer's Row, Too Many Clues, Aaron Go Bloody, The Disappearance of Mr. James Phillimore. All of these are titles from his Sebastian McCabe, Jeff Cody series, published by MX Publishing, one of our sponsors here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Dan has also written a number of Sherlock Holmes pastiches, such as The Sword of Death, House of the Doomed, and Baker Street Beat, which appear thanks to Wessex Press and MX Publishing. You can see how we keep our sponsors close. Dan's Sherlockian scholarship and short stories have also appeared in publications including the Sherlock Holmes Review, the Watsonian, the Sherlock Holmes Journal, and the Baker Street Journal, among others. And this January, Dan was just named the latest editor of the Baker Street Journal. Dan and his wife Ann live in the Cincinnati area, have 3 grown children and 6 grandchildren. They enjoy traveling, which is an endless source of experiences that are reflected in Dan's writing. And Dan was invested as a member of the Baker Street Irregulars in 2021 as St. Saviour's near King's Cross. Dan Andriacco, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
It's great to be back.
Well, you were with us first on episode 141, where we talked about Baker Street Beat, which is your blog, and of course your multiple Sherlockian writings, your Sebastian McCabe, Jeff Cody series, and I think a number of other books. How many Sherlock Holmes novels are you up to now, Dan?
Well, I've only written 2 pastiche novels, and I've written 3 other novels in which Sherlock Holmes is a character, but they're not pastiches, at least not by my definition. I consider a pastiche to be what Nick Meyer calls a forgery, something that's written in the Watson voice and is intended to be a story that could lead you to the illusion that this is actually the 61st story in the canon. The other 3 stories that I wrote were written in the third person and basically featured an American journalist named Enoch Hale, but Sherlock Holmes is a character in those stories. So I've written 5 books featuring Sherlock Holmes, but only 2 of them were pastiches.
Well, that's okay. We don't pass judgment one way or another here, so you're in luck. Well, you've had an entire career of writing and editing. You want to give us a little background on how Dan Andriacco, the scribe, came to be?
Well, that's interesting. I've always been interested in writing. I think when I was a kid in middle school, high school, I always wanted to be a writer, and I always wanted to be a fiction writer, actually. But I realized you couldn't make money being a fiction writer. In the old days, I guess you could have walked down the street to one of the pulp publishers, Street and Smith or something, and get a job there. But the best I could do was to become a newspaper reporter. So I worked at the late lamented Cincinnati Post, the afternoon newspaper in Cincinnati, for just shy of 24 years. And 13 of those years, I was the business editor. So I have a lot of experience editing as well as writing. And then I spent 20 years as communications director for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. And in that capacity as well, I did a lot of writing and a lot of editing.
That's quite a career. When you look back on all of that, well, now this is sort of a self-answering question, but particularly with all the change in the news, I mean, what's your perspective on your time in as a basically a journalist and editor? Do you feel it was time well spent? Do you lament the current state of the news? How does all that look to you?
I wouldn't change it for anything. Even the hard days were good. Recently, I read something by as I said, I was a business editor, and I read something by the fellow who was the business editor for the other newspaper in town at the same time. And he was writing on a Facebook page for former reporters of that same newspaper. And he said, "What I miss doesn't exist anymore." And I feel the same way. The business has just changed so much. I was a member of the journalism fraternity at a glorious time because it was a time of change and exciting change. When I first entered the business, we were typing on manual typewriters. And when I left in 1997, we were already well into the computer era.
So now you've been named the editor of the Baker Street Journal, and you just released your first issue, volume 73, number 1, for the spring of 2023. How do you perceive the Baker Street Journal with respect to that evolution in journalism? Is it still a vestige of what you knew before? Is it standing at kind of at the threshold of both old and new? Is it adopting the new? Where do you sense the BSJ is? Where would you like it to be?
Well, I really wouldn't put it into the context of journalism. It's a journal, but it's not journalism. And I think the position of the Baker Street Journal is unique. It is it has a tradition, but at the same time has evolved. I mean, originally everything in the Baker Street Journal in those very early issues, the old series and the first issues of the new series for a long time, only had essays that played the game. And of course, for many years now, we've also had Doylean articles. We've had articles relating to history. So it's a much broader scope of kinds of material, and I think that's really good. My goal is not to have every essay in the Baker Street Journal appeal to everybody, because as nice as that would be, that's just not possible. But what I hope is that there is something, more than one or two things. I'm hoping that there's quite a bit in every issue that appeals to everybody. In other words, this particular, maybe you're not into chronology, but you're into something else. There's somebody else who is into chronology, may not care that much about playing the game, whatever.
That's interesting. I like that a lot. And your observation about the wide appeal, the in each issue, and also how the content has changed over time, is really interesting. There are always times in the history of long-lived journals, and you know this better than anybody, where there's a change at the top and a new editor comes in, and for the Harvard Business Review or any kind of a journal, and when that happens, the new person coming in the doorway, tends to take a sort of a benchmark about, where are we? Where have we been? What does it look like now? What do I think should modify? So beyond, the wide appeal, I mean, what's your thing? How did that process work for you? When did you, what was the on-ramp period? Is this something you sort of thought about for 3 months or 3 weeks or?
Well, first of all, I'm walking in the footsteps of a giant here. I think Steve Rothman did this job for 23 years. So any changes would be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Right now I'm very much following precedent and not making any big changes. And I don't have any big changes planned. Uh, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So everything I've said has been the way it's been for quite a while. I mean,
Yeah.
the journal has been a mixture of lots of different kinds of material that appeal to wide readership. One thing that I do think is important, though, is that I think every issue should have some substantial number of articles playing the game.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's, as I said before, it's where we started with the Baker Street Journal. It's really a big part of the Baker Street Irregulars. The Baker Street Irregulars publish the Baker Street Journal, but it's not only for members of the Baker Street Irregulars. But still, it's important that it came out of the BSI. And in the very beginning, the BSI was a very much oriented toward playing the game and treating the sacred writings as the real thing. So I just think it's important as part of our tradition and history to have a substantial part of that, but not only that, as I said.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think what's interesting, Dan, is you've given deference to that history in your very first editor's gas lamp here. You actually called back to Edgar Smith's very first editor's gas lamp, right back to our very beginning in January of 1946. And Edgar, of course, was the first editor of the Baker Street Journal, and there have been, gosh, I'm trying to remember, 7, 8, 9 editors since. How does the count work?
I like to play with that a little bit. I call myself the 10th editor of record. And
Okay.
that's because my name is the 10th, but one of those names is Fred Porlock.
Oh.
We all remember that Fred Porlock was the anonymous person who alerted Sherlock Holmes in the beginning of the Valley of Fear. So I asked someone who would know, who was Fred Porlock? And the answer is that, and Fred Porlock was the editor of the Baker Street Journal for 1 year, or I think it was right after Peter Blau.
Yes.
And I was told that Fred Porlock was actually a number of people. So I don't know how that worked, whether it was a number of people in succession or a number of people together. But I'm going to assume that Fred Porlock is one person, and I'm going to say that I'm the 10th editor of record.
Oh,
I like that. That makes sense. So when you look back at the journal as it began under Edgar, it was, well, first of all, it was lushly produced. I mean, it was, first of all, it was a thick volume. It was designed, I think, by Paul McFarlane in conjunction with Ben Abramson as the publisher. And right off the bat, you had a journal that was a conglomerate of many different styles. There was poetry, there was Christopher Morley's clinical notes by a resident patient, there were pastiches, there were literary commentary. I mean, it was truly a wide variety of things. And I think we saw a nod to that in this very first issue of your version of the Baker Street Journal, in that there was a crossword puzzle. Talk about that. Yeah, I did. Talk about that, because, of course, the crossword puzzle goes back to the beginnings of the BSI. Talk about that decision on your part.
Well, frankly, it came about because of availability. A member of the illustrious clients of Indianapolis and the Tankerville Club, my own scion, Louise Haskett, likes to do crossword puzzles. And knowing that possibility was available, I asked her to do a crossword puzzle about the Creeping Man, because we have an essay in there about the Creeping Man, and this is the 100th anniversary of the publication of the Creeping Man. So I thought it would be interesting to go along with the essay on the Creeping Man, to have a crossword puzzle about it. And I probably wouldn't have thought of that if I didn't know somebody who did crossword puzzles. But I was very conscious of the fact that it goes right back to the very beginnings of the BSI.
Yeah. Yeah, and for our listeners who aren't aware, Christopher Morley kind of used the crossword puzzle that his brother Frank had created as an admissions test, if you will, for early membership in the BSI. And it was actually completed by a number of women as well. They were never granted that official BSI membership. However, it was acknowledged that they did in fact solve it. Is there any kind of prize associated with solving this crossword puzzle?
No, sorry. I didn't think of that.
In my issue, I think I probably have a misprinted issue, because I flipped through this very carefully, looked at the binding, the back cover. My copy just doesn't have the answers. How could that be? I mean, when will we get the answers to the crossword puzzle?
It's in there. It's later in the issue.
Oh, okay. I must have missed it.
Yeah, you see, but you do not observe, Bert.
Again. So one of the things, too, that's in your editor's gas lamp here is, and very welcome, too, the idea of associate editors. That the tradition, you say, is being revived. Mike McSwiggan is in the position, and Rich Krishunas also joins as copy editor. I think that's just brilliant, because part of the challenge of this is, when it becomes a one-man band, as it has been sometimes in the past, it can be a little onerous. But talk a little bit about that, would you?
Well, maybe it's because that's the way I always do things. In the Tankerville Club, which is my local scion, where I am the most scandalous member, I just think that there's wisdom in having a lot of other people involved. So I don't do everything myself. I don't lead all the discussions. I don't do all the toasts. I don't do the quiz. And I just think it always helps to have more people involved. I'm not smart enough to do everything by myself. And, Mike McSwiggan and Steve Doyle, the publisher, and the three of us talk about things a lot. I like to bounce ideas off of people. It's really interesting, too. You mentioned that women were some of the winners of the crossword puzzle. I'm very conscious of the fact that women have been involved in this Sherlockian project from the beginning, and that includes Lee Wright, who was a woman, being one of the associate editors from the early days of the Baker Street Journal. Women have always been part of the Baker Street Journal.
Yeah, and of
women
course,
have always
Edgar.
been an important part of the Baker Street Journal, and will certainly continue to be under my editorship.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Of course, Edgar employed his secretarial pool. He had 4 typists in his office. And they imagine that, taking your corporate assets and applying it to your hobby. Had to be a few heads being scratched around there. Well, the good news, Dan, is that when you have additional people like an associate editor, like a copy editor, you don't have to take all the blame. That's genius on your behalf.
Well, I do, really. I'm ultimately responsible, so you can throw the rotten eggs at me.
Well, let's pause for a moment here so people can throw rotten eggs at our sponsor. We'll be back in just a moment talking with Dan Andriacco.
One of the great Sherlockian periodicals is back, the 2021 Sherlock Holmes Review, edited by Steve Doyle, art direction by Mark Gagan, with all new contributions from Nicholas Meyer, Robert Doherty, Frank Cho, Anne Margaret Lewis, Steve Hockensmith, Les Klinger, Jimmy Aiken, and more. 118 pages about Sherlock Holmes, the illustrators, community, collecting, comics, reviews, film and TV, scholarship, including new artwork, Irene Adler drawn by the inimitable Frank Cho. It looks like a book and reads like a magazine. It's the Sherlock Holmes Review. Get your first edition copy of this essential 2021 Sherlockian Annual, the all-new Sherlock Holmes Review, at wesexpress.com.
Okay, we're back talking with Dan Andriacco, the brand spanking new editor of the Baker Street Journal. He still has that new editor smell about him, which is lovely.
Nobody spanked me yet, but that might be coming.
Well, speaking of new versus old, Steve Rothman, the previous editor, who, as you mentioned, was with the Baker Street Journal for 23 years, is still on the masthead as editor emeritus. Now, how do you picture that role working in conjunction with your role, Dan?
Well, editor emeritus per se is more of an honor than a role. He's not required to do anything, but he's been extremely generous in helping me and answering every question that I have, and always very quickly. I mean, this transition has been extremely smooth, thanks to Steve, and I'll be forever grateful about that. And he has done anything I've asked him to do. So I don't know what that might involve in the future.
Well, I mean, it's reassuring to have the previous editor around as a font of knowledge, as a sounding board, etc. I mean, think back to 1960 when Julian Wolfe unceremoniously had to take over the Baker Street Journal because of Edgar's sudden death. And we all know that Julian managed the typing himself. He didn't have that secretarial pool that Edgar had. He had 2 typewriters set up in his dining room. He handled all of the mailing himself. Now you've got not only Steve as your previous editor to act as a sounding board, but you have a whole business staff as well to rely on for the distribution, the subscriptions, etc. How do you see kind of bridging that gap between your editorial self and kind of your management self as regards the journal?
I'm really only responsible for editorial content, and I do occasionally get questions about subscriptions and that sort of thing that come to my email address, and I forward them on. And Margaret Lewis continues to very, very capably handling the subscription part of it, And then there's certain publisher issues that Steve Doyle handles. I'm essentially the editorial guy. I am responsible for all of the editorial content. Whatever you see on the contents page, I'm responsible for it being there. Even as to the order in which it proceeds, which is something I'd never thought about before. But that's something you have to give some consideration to. Which article should come first, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the article or essay that's first is the most important. There are different considerations there. Sometimes it has to do with length or topic. My promise is that we're going to have a lot of variety of topic, and that also includes, well, maybe you don't want to have 2 or 3 Sherlockian or essays playing the game all in a row. Maybe you want to mix them up a little bit. So it's kind of an interesting challenge.
Yeah. Well, that's bringing to bear your experience as a business editor. You're putting the section together. What's the flow of articles? What's more important, or what should come first more than something else? But how's your the log look? I mean, in terms of future content and articles and backlogs, are there themes? Are there wants and wishes that you're interested in, that that you're thinking about, that maybe some of our listeners could take as advice in thinking about what to send you?
I'm trying to think how much trouble am I going to get into by saying this?
All of the trouble.
What I'd really like is more female writers. It surprised me. I took over a kind of a pretty good backlog of essays when I took over, and I realized there are just not that many women writing for the BSJ. So I have I've contacted a number of people and requested that they write something, and they've agreed to, but it hasn't come through yet. So that's one thing. Another thing, as I said, I always want to have some good essays playing the game, but it can be very wide range. I can't think of anything in particular that we're really lacking right now. We have a good backlog, but the summer issue has been sent off to the publisher, and I've got autumn already pretty well locked down.
Oh, that's great.
Wow. It is.
Yeah.
Is there any type of submission that you will refuse? For example, I know Steve Rothman before you was not a fan of poetry, even though there was poetry in earlier versions of the BSJ, earlier editions. Is there anything that is completely verboten as far as you're concerned?
Well, we don't do pastiches, and they were part of the early BSJ as well. And we'll be maintaining Steve's prohibition on poetry as well, except for the one exception is annually we publish the poem that wraps up the BSI weekend.
Yeah, I noticed in this case it was a truncated version of the poem. And
that's not the first time that's been done. Steve started that tradition. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting because
you get into space issues.
Well, that's exactly it. And of course, the Baker Street Journal has a website that you can refer people to at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And in this case, when space was an issue and the annual summation of the BSI weekend that Betsy and Al Rosenblatt put together was truncated, you referred people to the website to read the full version. And it is full, by the way.
You not only saw, but you observed.
Yes. And I also solved the crossword puzzle with the help of the answers on page 55. I was amazed at myself.
Well done. Well done. How about the Christmas annual? Is that is that just part of the editorial process? Is that all locked up? I mean, what goes into creating that each year?
It is a part of. Well, there's one difference, and that is that each a Christmas annual has an editor, and I have to keep reminding Jim Hawkins he is the editor. Now I'll still read everything, but basically. Jim was in charge of rounding up the writers. It's devoted to John Bennett Shaw, and Jim Hawkins is probably the greatest living authority on John Bennett Shaw, but there are others as well. And he rounded them up, and basically that's practically locked down as well. I mean, we're only waiting for one essay, and it's going to be great. I think anybody who is interested in John Bennett Shaw will love it. Anybody who doesn't have an interest in John Bennett Shaw will have an interest in John Bennett Shaw after they read this.
Well, it's strange. Nobody asked me to participate. I had the perfect essay, too, Dan. It was, and I'm joking, of course, but John Bennett Shaw wrote a terrible, hysterical, not safe for work essay. Years ago, presented it at the 1971 annual BSI dinner, but Julian refused to put it in print. And wow. Shaw had to go elsewhere, and with permission of his one of his children, we published it on the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere website. So we'll have that in the show notes as kind of an addendum to give people a sense as to the raucous good humor of this man as a teaser for them to get a BSJ subscription, which includes that Christmas annual about John Bennett Shaw.
That would be great.
What's your thinking about subscriptions? I mean, are you happy with the number of readers? Do you think you'd like to grow 5%? You think we have too many? You think maybe different forms? I mean, you thinking anything about that?
Well, Christopher Morley was famous for saying, "Never has so much been written by so many for so few," and I would like for it to be less few.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
we're never going to say there are too many subscribers. That's for sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean
I really think, when I'm asked what do I think of the role of the BSJ, I always say I feel like the BSJ is the lingua franca of the Sherlockian universe. It's something that everybody should have as a uniting thing, something that brings people together. And one of the things that Steve Doyle and I are very excited about the upcoming summer issue is that there are 4 pages worth of letters to the editor, which really shows great reader engagement in the publication.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah.
What about formatting and layout? How does that work for the journal? Are you doing are you doing basically TypeScript to layout do you turn over like a complete production ready file for the next step of the process, or does somebody help you with that? I mean, I'm just curious.
When it leaves my hands, it's not production ready in that Steve Doyle is the one who determines exactly where the photos go and that sort of thing. He takes care of that part of the layout. But part of my responsibility is getting it into the proper font. We have our own font that was designed just for the Baker Street Journal. Probably a lot of people wouldn't know that. It's a variety of Baskerville. So everything has to get into that font. It has to get into the right font size. And then we have just certain things that we do. Like every essay begins in what's called small cap. So I have to code it so that the first few words begin in small cap. And there are other particularities like that. Like every time you have a quote, a block quote, it's got to be in a narrower font or a narrower margin, that sort of thing. Yeah, so that kind of stuff is within my responsibility.
Well, that's fascinating. I never realized we had a font of the Baskervilles.
What do you font of the Baskervilles? What's the name of the font? Is it BSJ?
It's Baskerville WP, which stands for Wessex Press.
Oh, very
nice.
good. Cool.
Very nice. That's more detail than I think we had considered. I mean, most people don't think of that level of scrutiny and detail that goes into the editing process, but it's absolutely necessary. It's you might say it's a great Grimpen Mire of responsibility.
but what's interesting too is that does harken back to the beginning, because Christopher Morley, Edgar Smith, all these folks grew up fascinated by participating in, engaged in printing design and layout. And in fact, when you look at some of the stuff Christopher Morley would produce or write, some of his original documents, he actually just did the typeset. He said, okay, this is going to be 12 point on 16, and here's the spacing, and his notes arranged the printed copy on the page. So that really does go back to the beginning in a way.
Well, formatting is not the most interesting part of the job, but it is necessary.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us, Dan, about the upcoming summer issue of the Baker Street Journal?
Well, let's see. How much should I tell you? I don't want to spoil
enough to get a few less subscribers.
Well, we have an essay about Sherlock Holmes as a hard-boiled hero. We have Bill Mason writing about the world's greatest pun, "There's no police like Holmes."
Oh.
We have a wonderful little essay about how a secretary reading A Case of Identity led her to be a major witness in a court case not too long after that story was published, in which she was able to identify the fact that something did not come from her typewriter as a result of reading A Case of Identity. We have Rich Krishunas writing in defense of Baron Gruner, how he, as a veteran defense attorney, would have defended Baron Gruner. We give a little instruction on how to cheat at whist in the empty house. And we have a very nice essay on how not everybody mourned for Sherlock Holmes. Somebody has done the research and found out that when Holmes went over to Reichenbach, some naysayers were saying, "Well, it's about time."
Were they all named Conan Doyle?
No.
Well, that sounds like a delightful lineup there. And I do have to note how often Rich Kriskunis actually takes on the defense of the malevolent in the canon. It seems to be a hobby.
It is a signature characteristic of his.
I know. I love it. I love it. A lot of fun. Well, Dan, for people who would like to submit material to the Baker Street Journal, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, the best way is simply to write to my email address, which is, take this down, bsj.editor@gmail.com.
bsj.editor@gmail.com. That's easy to remember.
What I try to do is get back to everybody within 24 hours to acknowledge that I at least received it. Now, I do tend to travel a bit. And when I'm traveling, I will have my email set to let people know that I may not see it right away. But when I see an email, I will acknowledge it. And then I will try to get back to people within a few days after that. And when I get back to them, the answer might be, I love this and I want to use it. Or the answer might be, I think this needs some work and here are my suggestions. Or the answer might be that I don't really think this is for us and here are a few other places you might try.
Oh, that's great.
I've had some really, really good experiences working with a number of authors who I thought had a really good idea, but there was something lacking or some improvement needed, and they've all been very willing to work with me. And I've enjoyed that part of the job very much.
Wow, that's encouraging. And we hope that you will continue to enjoy this job for many years into the future. Dan Andriacco, editor of the Baker Street Journal, thank you for joining us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thanks a lot.
It's great to talk to Dan because he's got clearly so much energy, and I think his which is not to say that Stephen Rothman did not have energy, but it's great to talk to somebody who's coming into something like this new. But it's also great to hear these themes of playing the game, of women, to have defined these roles of the associate editors, Mike McSwiggan and Rich Kriskunis, and the letters, the engagement from readers. It's really nice. It was a great, I think it was just, I feel very good about, the prospect ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's always nice when you get a fresh set of eyes on things, even though, as Dan admits in his first editor's gas lamp here, that he first started reading the journal in 1971. He does bring a fresh editor's eyes to it, and I think that will be all the better. I did want to note, though, Bert, that as Dan was putting out that plaintive plea for more work by women, I applaud that, certainly. You yourself are not immune from taking advantage of that, because let's not forget that Christopher Morley, in his early days with the Baker Street Journal, submitted work under the name of Jane Nightwork. So you need to figure out who your Jane Nightwork is and get to work on that.
Oh, that's a great. It's a great tip. That's a wonderful challenge. I'll have to think about that. I mean, names like Angela Philpott come to mind. I think. I know Ariadne Philpott. There's a good name. Oh, but now I've said it, so I can't use. Oh,
That's too bad.
drat.
I'm sure you'll figure out a workaround.
Yeah.
Well, if you're enjoying this conversation with Dan Andriacco, the editor, you might also enjoy some time spent with Dan Andriacco, the author. Our friends at MX Publishing have a number of Dan's books, including his entire Sebastian McCabe Jeff Cody series. The most recent entry is No Ghosts Need Apply. It's accompanied by Murderer's Row, Too Many Clues, Death Mask, Queen City Corpse, Aaron Go Bloody, Bookmarked for Murder, Rogue's Gallery, The Disappearance of Mr. James Fillmore, The 1895 Murder, Holmes, Sweet Holmes, and No Police Like Holmes. It's an opportunity to sleuth the streets of Erin, Ohio, with this great duo in the spirit of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. So check out the Sebastian McCabe Jeff Cody series by Dan Andriacco when you go to mxpublishing.com. All right, it's time for everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right, it's Canonical Couplets. If we give you 2 lines of poetry, then you are simply expected to feed them back to us in the form of the name of the story that we were talking about. We do this in every episode, and in every episode there is a prize associated with it. So I think we will get to the last canonical couplet, which went like this. Actors and journalists, this story states, can bring to begging certain basic traits. Okay, Bert, this is where we put you on the spot. Do you know which Sherlock Holmes story we are talking about?
Yes, yeah, well, all of that, is just a misdirection because the case involves the missing rugby player who was a vegan and an environmentalist and a naturalist. It's the case Watson called the missing tree hugger.
Oh, boy. The missing tree hugger. Yeah, there's something missing here.
Oh,
Bert.
I guess that was wrong.
No. And of course, Eric Deckers once again comes to our rescue, but not without a little frivolity, first of all. He says, I think I've got it. It's the story about the wannabe comedian who tries way too hard at parties to seem clever and insightful, but merely states the painfully obvious. It's the story called The Man with the Ham-Fisted Quip. And Eric writes, I realize I'm now in danger of starring in my own story, so instead I'll say that this one is The Man with the Twisted Lip. Well, that is correct, Eric. And we had a number of other people who also submitted correct responses. So what we will do, what we do every time when we have entries to the canonical couplet, is we will spin the big prize wheel, waiting for it to slow down, and ultimately landing on number 19. Number 19. And it looks like that goes to Luann Connell. Luann, congratulations. You have won yourself a copy of R.A. Dworkin's Sherlock Holmes and the Dinnertime Mystery, one of his children's books that we mentioned in the last episode. So congratulations on that. We will send you a copy of that. Just need to get your mailing address and we will take care of business there. Well, now, this means it's time for another canonical couplet, and in this case, we'll give you this clue. By this, we're taught the all-important truth that brothers seldom share a single tooth. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. All right, and I think this time around we will have a copy of the latest issue of the Baker Street Journal available for our lucky winner. So hats off to anyone who gives that a shot and gets it right. We'll make sure we take good care of you. Well, Bertram, we've done it again.
Yes, thanks to you.
Well, thanks to everyone here, the whole community of people here at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. All of our research staff, our editors, our producers, our writers, our musicians, the whole in-studio audience. I mean, it's really an effort of twos.
The technology team, the legal staff, the copy editors, sound design. It's just wonderful.
It reminds me of how Car Talk used to thank their staff at the end of every show. And the names they would come up with there, like their director of long-range planning, Kay Sarah, who married Frank Sarah and became Kay Sarah.
Right, and they always referred to the Three Stooges law firm when they Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe.
Yeah. And their Russian chauffeur, pick up and drop off. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of names. That was a lot of fun. Well, for those of you who don't follow Car Talk, congratulations.
Yeah. That's not still going, isn't it? Didn't that stop some years ago?
They wound the show down because one of the brothers, I think it was Tom, developed Alzheimer's, and the show's been in syndication for a while since. I think they went off the air in 2012. They went into syndication, and I think they actually wrapped up the syndication deal in the last couple of years. So you can still find it online, find all the back episodes on their website, but sadly no longer being broadcast, and certainly no new episodes. But, our show in many ways was inspired by Car Talk, these two zany brothers who had a very niche interest. And there was obviously a lot of call-in stuff. There was a quiz there, and they would generally have a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, they were very creative.
They were. But sadly, Sherlockians are saddled with us instead. So, well, let's saddle up and get out of here, as this is the saddle-worn and weary Scott Monty.
And I'm the perpetually lassoed Bert Wolder.
And together, we say...
The game's afoot.
Oh, you damn it, you did it. The game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I'm neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.